I'm pressing live. Welcome back to Activist News Network. Today is January 10th, 2026. We have a very special guest on the show today, Ricardo Vaz. Ricardo, who is based in Caracas, Venezuela, is a journalist, political analyst, and editor at Venezuela Analysis. Ricardo, thank you so much for coming on the show and welcome.
Hi, Jamil. Thanks for the invitation. It's good to be back here.
So, Ricardo, when we last had you on the show, in September, it was just after the U.S. deployed more than 4,000 Marines and sailors and no fewer than 3 naval destroyers, along with a nuclear-powered fast attack submarine, spy aircraft, and guided missile cruiser to surround Venezuela. Today, we invite you back to discuss the latest escalation in war against Venezuela. This past Saturday, January 3rd, the U.S. military launched a large-scale attack on Venezuela to capture and kidnap Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and First Lady, First Combatant Cilia Flores. According to Telesur, missiles rained down on army bases, airfields, and key infrastructure across the capital, Caracas, and the surrounding region. By 2 a.m., U.S. Special Forces reached Maduro's residence and abducted him along with his wife. They were then boarded onto a U.S. warship and flown to the U.S. President Maduro and Flores are currently held at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, New York, and face a series of absurd criminal charges. The U.S. now claims that it will run Venezuela indefinitely and that has seized Venezuelan oil and natural resources. Ricardo, we have a series of questions about this profoundly disconcerting news. But we first wanted to ask you, what is your reaction and an analyst of the kidnapping of Venezuelan President Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores?
Yes, indeed. I think disconcerting is the right description for what we're going through here in the country and also abroad. Actually, just so I don't forget, there have been regular demonstrations outside this Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, supporting Maduro and opposing his absurd kidnapping and arrest. So let me start from what happened early last week. So on Monday, both Maduro and Flores were arraigned in a court in New York. They both pleaded non-guilty to the charges. So the charges are narcoterrorism, conspiracy to import cocaine, and conspiracy to possess machine guns. So, one is more absurd than the other. But it all started with narcoterrorism. This has been a narrative that's been propagated by U.S. officials for several years. The idea that the Venezuelan government is somehow a drug cartel involved in shipping drugs to the U.S. And it has been contradicted by many sources, but I think the most damning of all is the U.S.'s own drug enforcement agency, the DEA. So the DEA, for example, in its 2024 report, does not even mention the word Venezuela. It's completely irrelevant for global drug trafficking, and other specialized agencies have found this picture consistently over the years. But not only that, U.S. officials never presented any credible evidence of the involvement of Maduro or any other high-ranking officials in any kind of narcotics activities. And this is so damning that the evidence comes from the U.S. itself. So the U.S. indicted Maduro first in 2020 under these narco-terrorism charges and accusing him of running this so-called Cartel de los Soles, Cartel of the Suns. This is an old term dating back to the 1990s in reference to the sun that the Venezuelan military carries on their uniforms. But then, now that Maduro was actually kidnapped and taken to court, the new indictment, the indictment that the U.S. Justice Department presented, just quietly dropped any reference to the Cartel de los Soles. So even the U.S. Justice Department knows that there is no way that this narrative would hold up, even in a U.S. court, with all the bias that we can expect there. So it just goes to show how these narratives are propagated, how the media establishment just lends itself and even helps propagating these absolutely absurd narratives so long as they promote U.S. foreign policy interests. I think it's also damning on U.S. allies across the region, for example, Argentina, Ecuador, and I think Paraguay. They all passed legislation or resolutions proclaiming the Cartel de los Soles as a terrorist organization. Now it turns out that the organization does not even exist. So it just goes to show how embarrassing it is to just subject themselves to whatever U.S. foreign policy is. But right now, I mean, we have this trial. It's expected to be kind of a protracted battle, but there are plenty of elements to immediately challenge the U.S.'s action. So Venezuelan president's lawyer, Barry Pollack, he's the one who also defended WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. He said he's going to prepare some kind of very thick litigation ahead of the next hearing, which is in March, challenging first and foremost the legality of the U.S. abducting militarily abducting a sitting president, which is, of course, a blatant violation of international law, which grants immunity to heads of state. And I'm sure there's going to be plenty of other arguments to, legally expose this travesty of justice that is the prosecution against Venezuela's president.
Thank you for that. As you can imagine, we are receiving very little news in the US about what is happening in Caracas, what life is, and what's happening in the rest of Venezuela since the US attack and kidnapping of President Maduro and First Lady Cilia Flores. Ricardo, what is life like in Venezuela? Certainly, like any country, we are sure that the Venezuelan people are not a monolith, but what has been the reaction of Venezuelan people? Is there support of President Maduro? Is there support and confidence in Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, who now leads the government?
Yes, let me take you through. I mean, it's been just over a week since this began. And I mean, the initial reaction, I was awake when the bombings began. It was just a complete trauma and shock having to witness this live. And I wasn't especially close to any of the sites being bombed. But, the people who witnessed it more closely. I mean, it's going to be a process to deal with this, to deal with such a blatant attack on the country, something that had never happened before. But what followed was not any semblance of chaos or unrest. I mean, there was, disorientation, confusion, but I think it's a testament to Chavismo and its level of organization at the grassroots. The fact that it can quickly deploy and reassure the communities, ensure that there's no violent unrest, that there's no disorder, provide support for the most vulnerable. So this was in the early hours, which were pretty deserted. But then, another, I would say, healthy instinct of Chavismo is that whenever there's a threat, people mobilize immediately close to the presidential palace in Miraflores here in central Caracas. It's about 10 minutes from where I live. So you immediately saw crowds gathering on Saturday morning. And that was still a time of a lot of uncertainty. We didn't know what was going on. Venezuelan officials only provided official statements in the afternoon. But since then, what we've seen have been daily mobilizations from popular movements, from political parties, in support, first and foremost, of Maduro, demanding his release and return, but also backing the acting government of Delcy Rodriguez. It's important to clarify that this is not some kind of improvised solution. This is actually also a testament to the Venezuelan institutions that were not paralyzed. I mean, as traumatizing and shocking and even unexpected as these events were, there was kind of an immediate understanding of what needed to be done. So the Venezuelan Constitution, approved in 1999, does not have a clause explaining what happens if a president is abducted by a foreign empire, but there is an explanation for what's called a temporary leave. And in that case, the vice president, Delcy Rodriguez in this case, assumes the presidency in an interim basis, in an acting basis for a period of 3 months, which can then be renewed by the National Assembly. And that's what we're seeing right now. Delcy was sworn in on Monday by the National Assembly that was coincidentally also taking office for a new legislative period. But the thing that I wanted to highlight, which I think is the most likely to be ignored by the foreign press and by the media establishment, is this constant mobilizations in Caracas and to a smaller extent across the country, defending the revolution, denouncing these barbaric imperialistic attacks, and demanding the release and return of Maduro and First Lady Cilia Flores.
Yes, mentioning that, in the US, there's been a lot of, false reports, as we understand, but for our audience, that there is conflict between the vice president and other members of the government. What is actually going on in this regard, and why is it important to reject speculation, especially during times like we are in today?
Yeah, I mean, before getting into that, also mention and highlight that there have been plenty of mobilizations abroad and in US cities as well. I mean, just today I was seeing mobilizations in Denver, Colorado, for example. So, I mean, if people are interested in getting involved, they should look up solidarity organizations and political organizations that are right now heavily involved in highlighting and not allowing this Venezuela situation to just, go to just pass by unnoticed. But yes, I mean, in one sense, this early confusion fuels speculation, but then there's also malicious efforts to try and present a picture of division and even uh, put out the hypothesis that Maduro was betrayed by his inner circle. There's no evidence to that effect, and I think, in fact, the evidence contradicts it. And just to mention one example, earlier today there was a report on the Washington Post that had plenty of speculative efforts about prior negotiations and so on, but it quoted one U.S. official saying that there was no this plan of what the U.S. was going to execute was not communicated to Delcy Rodriguez or anyone else because it would have compromised the operation had they been aware of it. So I mean, we have to understand that there's also a communicational and psychological dimension to this operation, and one of them is spreading these false rumors, which basically have no consequence. No one holds the media accountable. No one holds these quote unquote influencers accountable. So that's why you see such a widespread propagation of rumors.
Yes, it's very important to note. Thank you also for mentioning the actions that have happened inside of the US in support of Venezuela, in support of President Maduro and First Lady Celia's release. In the US, we're constantly getting reports of, well, look, the Venezuelan people are so happy. They're so happy that their dictator has been finally prosecuted, and they're showing videos of gusanos in Miami, right? Like, they don't, the media understands what they're doing, but the average US citizens and a lot of people around the world that consume a lot of US propaganda do not understand what they're seeing is a curated action in a particular area. These are not actions inside of Venezuela. And as you mentioned, there has been ongoing actions since last Saturday.
Let me just add something to that effect, because I mean, I did a lot of interviews last week, and one of them I kind of parachuted into a right-wing British radio, and I actually didn't really know what I was getting into. But the guy was asking me, what about all the demonstrations of Venezuelans inside the country who are celebrating Maduro's arrest? And I told him, that must be in Miami, because here I haven't seen anything. And actually, to the contrary, I mean, even before the U.S. military operation and presidential abduction, the polls consistently showed, and I mean, there's a variety of polls, show that there was opposition to any kind of direct U.S. military intervention, even for the people who don't support Maduro and who would rather see somebody else in the presidential chair. That certainly does not mean that they would want it to happen this way, in such a blatant violation, not just of international law, but of Venezuelan sovereignty.
Right. Exactly. And so going down that road, as a follow-up question, and we do apologize if this question overlaps with some of the analysis that you just outlined, but we wanted to get your thoughts on why. Why did the US kidnap President Maduro and his wife, combatant First Lady, Cilia Flores? Why did that happen?
I think we have to put it into a broader perspective. I'll get to Venezuela specifically in a moment, but we saw a few weeks ago, or maybe a couple of months ago, this new kind of policy document, national security perspective from the U.S., where it's basically outlined that the U.S. wants to reimpose its dominance in what they believe to be their hemisphere. I mean, I'm sure you saw this disgusting picture of Trump as a mob boss, and the words "our hemisphere." So it is a first step in that regard, and it's a step targeting perhaps, and of course I'm a little bit biased here, but targeting the most direct challenge to U.S. hegemony that has happened in this hemisphere in the past quarter century. I mean, of course, Cuba is always a factor as well. So that on one hand. On the other, and don't take this from me or any other analyst, I mean, take it from Trump himself, it's all about the oil. And we saw this degrading spectacle yesterday at the White House of these oil executives, and Trump making a sales pitch like this is a war bounty, that is a war chest that is about to spread. So it was a matter of the U.S. wanting to reassert its dominance over what it believes to be its sphere of influence, to prepare itself for a future confrontation with China by ensuring preferential and privileged access to the largest oil reserves here and around the world. And in that same process, taking out a revolutionary process, which of course has its own contradictions, which are then exacerbated by a U.S. imperialist siege that has been escalating over the past 25 years. But it's a political and geostrategic attack under this broader idea of reimposing U.S. dominance here in the hemisphere. And you saw immediately afterwards Trump saying that Cuba, Colombia, Mexico might be next. So it really is imperialism unleashed. And maybe later on we can also talk about what's the regional response been, and what can it do to kind of stand up and not allow this to become the norm.
Yes, we definitely will. And thank you for mentioning, how the U.S. specifically through their president and their foreign policy has this idea that they own this hemisphere, like it's the U.S.'s hemisphere, and it's not our hemisphere. It's not our Americas. Even as we look at the U.S., how they refer to themselves as America, right? When we're an entire continent, from Alaska all the way down to Chile, we're all connected, including, different parts of the Caribbean. We all live in the same region together. So thank you for mentioning that. So, how are the violations of sovereignty in 1989 with the kidnapping of Noriega in Panama, and in 2004 with the kidnapping of President Aristide in Haiti, a pretext to the current situation that we see today in Venezuela? Since you're mentioning, the regional approach that the U.S. has where we live.
Yeah, I think those are two very relevant examples. I mean, not to mention all the history of U.S. coups in the region. I mean, we could just take since the Second World War, cases like Guatemala or Chile. I think those are useful precedents and comparisons up to a certain point. So in the case of Noriega was first a CIA asset. He was very servile to U.S. interests, and he was actually a drug trafficker. So he was using the Panamanian state as a platform to distribute drugs. Of course, that was not the issue. I mean, drug trafficking has always been strongly correlated to U.S. presence, DEA presence, CIA, whatever you want to call it. But Noriega, at some point, U.S. officials felt that he was out of line, that he was trying to act a bit too independently, and they struck decisively. Of course, we should keep in mind that Panama is very strategic because of the Panama Canal. We saw it was one of the first things that Trump said when he came back into office. We're going to retake the Panama Canal, and now we're also hearing this dangerous but still nonsense about Greenland. So that's what happened in Panama. And with Haiti, I would put it in a broader perspective of the collective West never forgiving Haiti for what it dared to do in the late 1700s and early 1800s of abolishing slavery, kicking out colonization. It has just been a sequence of unlimited punishment against the Haitian people for their desire to be free. So in that sense, the precedents are useful for us to understand that those actions had no real consequences for the U.S. So even though they happened under one Bush and then another Bush, and now we have a worse exponent in Trump, they showed that the U.S. can get away with these blatant violations of international law with no accountability whatsoever. I mean, in the case of Aristide, they basically shipped him off, I think, to South Africa at the time, and had him step out of the way. Actually, there was a story later that Chavez somehow was not aware in real time because he wanted to offer asylum to Aristide. And Aristide is different from Noriega because he was really trying to pursue Haitian sovereignty and reassert some kind of pride in the country, as opposed to just being completely manipulated by U.S. interests. But so those actions and plenty of others, coming to Venezuela specifically, this economic terrorism with unilateral sanctions. We saw recently just the piracy acts of seizing oil tankers in international waters. Those actions. This is just a buildup and a pattern of just being an international outlaw, because the international law, as clear as it is, has no enforcement mechanisms. And so there's no cost at all for the US, and that's why people like Trump, who have an even smaller regard for the forms, I mean, they just drop the mask all completely. They drop the masks altogether and go impose US interests in the most violent ways we can imagine, which is what we're seeing here in Venezuela over the past week.
Yes, thank you for also expressing that President Aristide was an elected president, right, versus Noriega, who worked heavily with the US government until he started wanting to work for his own interests. And also mentioning the other ways the US has intervened in different areas inside of our hemisphere, even before World War II, right? We look at Nicaragua with the constant US meddling and invasions, even with them setting up their dictator, Somoza and baby Somoza. You mentioned Chile, which is very important for us to understand. So we have many, many examples of the US meddling in other sovereign countries and completely getting away with it. So we understand how we got to where we are today with the kidnapping of President Maduro and First Lady Cilia. So you mentioned earlier talking about some of the regional bodies' responses, and so we want to ask you a question around that. So what is your assessment of the response of the attacks and kidnapping from the region, the regional bodies such as CARICOM, CELAC, as well as the responses in Africa, like from the African Union, Asia, like the response that we got from Russia and China, and other parts of the world? Why is it important for Latin America and the Caribbean? This is like a part 2 of that question. To be a zone of peace, like a true zone of peace, and for that call to come from the grassroots and to uphold this call for a zone of peace.
Yeah, this actually ties to what we were discussing in the previous question. And I mean, I'm going to sound harsh here, but I think the international response has not been up to the circumstances. I mean, all things considered, a positive statement from a group of Latin American countries. I think it was Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Spain, and I think Uruguay. But even though they condemned the violations of international law and emphasized the importance of the zone of peace, they didn't make an explicit demand for the release and return of Maduro, which I think would be any kind of starting point for an international response. Same thing goes for other international bodies which expressed concern for violations of international law. In the case of CELAC, CELAC is a very broad body because it brings everybody together, and at the same time, it has very underwhelming decision mechanisms because it requires consensus. And so from the moment where you have several US aligned governments, and that's putting it very generously, you're never going to get any kind of unified response. And lastly, I think it's also important to talk about the role of Russia and China, because these are key Venezuelan allies who have become even more important in recent years because of these US economic attacks. But at the same time, there's only so much they are willing to do. We saw 2 UN Security Council meetings prior to the January 3 operation, and those just involved condemnation and calls for de-escalation, calls for respect for international law. I mean, we were already seeing these extrajudicial executions of of these small boats at the high seas on this very always unproven accusation of drug trafficking. But even after the January 3 attacks and Maduro kidnapping, there was a UN Security Council meeting a couple of days later. And it also, I mean, again, it included even more forceful statements condemning US attacks, condemning the kidnapping of Maduro, condemning the violations of sovereignty, international law, and so on. But again, the UN Security Council members did not even put forward a resolution. Of course, we understand that the US would veto a resolution, but at least take a step to further expose the US as a kind of pariah in international law. So I think the international response has been measured at a time where it's clearly not going to work. I mean, the US, don't take it from me. I mean, take it from Rubio saying we don't care about the UN. Trump, I think it was yesterday, said that the only limits to what he's going to do are his own morality and his own mind, which is a very scary proposition given how he has lost his mind and has never had any morals. So for it's of course fundamental for this to be a zone of peace, and it was a very powerful declaration when it was declared in 2014. But it's not just going to happen via statements. I think the governments here in the region have to understand that just trying to stay in the US's good graces is not going to work in the long run. So they have to figure out a more forceful, united response that makes it clear that there's going to be a political cost for these kinds of blatant violations of international law.
Yes, thank you for that answer. So we want to ask you, as we're wrapping up this interview, what lies ahead for Venezuela? And again, we do apologize if this question overlaps some of the analysis that you've already outlined. But many analysts on the so called left said that it's unlikely that the US will be able to, quote, run the country, as President Trump and Marco Rubio have been very loudly proclaiming. And instead, Venezuela will turn into another Vietnam, Afghanistan, or Iraq. Some other analysts have made comparisons with Libya or Haiti. But how do you see things playing out in Venezuela going forward? And also, how much closer does this bring us to World War III? Or are we already in World War III?
I'm not really sure how I would classify the beginning of World War III, but we're definitely seeing a global rising of temperature. I mean, a bit of an understatement. And it might be that this kind of unilateral actions are going to reproduce themselves, and they're going to lead to other U.S. allies feeling equally emboldened to try some things like this. But what in terms of what lies ahead, I think we have to look at the oil industry, and of course, Trump, Rubio, and other U.S. officials are just going to continue to make these very boisterous statements, pretending that they are in charge of the country. Of course, in reality, it's not as easy as it sounds. But it's clear from what we're seeing so far that the U.S. wants to assert control over the Venezuelan oil industry and impose or try to impose a colonial model whereby the oil sale proceeds go to to a U.S. account, and then the U.S. Finds a way to return part of it to Venezuela. I think this is a very new colonial arrangement that is, of course, being imposed at gunpoint against the Venezuelan authorities. I mean, we have seen overt threats of a second wave of bombings, and also taking advantage of the mere shock and trauma of what has happened so far. So I think in the coming days, we're going to see very blatant statements of US control. And then, of course, as time goes on, we'll have to see how Venezuelan authorities try to reassert or maneuver to defend the country's sovereignty, defend the sovereignty of the Venezuelan people going forward, and hopefully in an international context that offers greater opposition to these unilateral US actions.
Yes. And lastly, how can, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, but speaking as a Venezuelan, let us know how we should, or how could social movements around the world, especially in the US, stand in solidarity with the Bolivarian Republic and the Venezuelan people?
Yeah, I think the most important thing right now is to be active, to be on the streets, to be visible, to be loud, to not allow these false narratives that the Venezuelan people have welcomed this action, to not allow those kind of false narratives to take hold, and first and foremost to understand who the enemy is. U.S. imperialism is the main enemy here in the region, around the world, and that's where the energy of social movements has to be focused, and not allow Venezuela to just fade into the background. Understanding that the Venezuelan government is going to have some very tricky conditions, and again, that's an understatement, having to deal with this constant threat against them, trying to figure out what's best to kind of navigate the present scenario. But I think over time, the U.S. has always underestimated the Bolivarian movements. They are the heart and soul of the Bolivarian Revolution, and that's kind of the strategic reserve that can allow the Bolivarian Revolution to survive and grow again and become stronger moving forward.
Thank you very much. Those are all the questions that we have for you today. But before we close out, is there anything else that you wanted to add or address?
No, I mean, again, I really appreciate the invitation. I think it's important that we have these thorough, in-depth discussions right now. Just recommend that people follow Venezuela Analysis. We're doing our best to keep up with all the developments and also kind of provide analysis as things are unfolding. And again, this is a dark hour. It has been very difficult, but no one is shying away from the struggle ahead.
Yes. Well, that being said, thank you very much for coming on the show. It has been an honor learning from you, and we look forward to having you back soon, hopefully in better and more positive conditions.
Thank you so much, Jamila. It has been, taking into account the circumstances, a pleasure to be here, and also thanks to Ryan for helping set this up.
Yes, of course. All right, everyone. Have a great night. We'll talk with you on the next time on Activist News Network.